This is the Mountain and Prairie Podcast. I'm Ed Robertson. My guest today is Mark Easter. Mark is a Colorado-based ecologist and author whose new book is titled The Blue Plate, A Food Lover's Guide to Climate Chaos. If you care about food and you care about planet Earth, The Blue Plate is a must-read. It explores the production, consumption, and disposal of many of our favorite foods: seafood, salad, bread, chicken, steak, potatoes, ice cream, and more. And it offers a thoughtful and nuanced analysis of these foods' impacts on the environment. This is not a gloom-and-doom climate change book, nor does it have the condescending tone that sometimes accompanies many climate-related readings. While Mark is crystal clear about the massive threats facing our planet, this book is built on the ideals of optimism, ingenuity, and taking action. I loved it. Mark lives and works in Fort Collins and has conducted research in academia and private industry since 1988. He's enjoyed a very successful and impactful career at Colorado State University, and he's authored and co-authored more than 50 scientific papers and reports related to carbon cycling and the carbon footprint of agriculture, forestry, and other land uses. But Mark also has a real gift for storytelling and for breaking down enormously complex topics into understandable and enjoyable writing. His writing is personal, educational, and fun to read, and I credit Mark and the Blue Plate with helping me to finally fully understand issues around greenhouse gas emissions and carbon sequestration. Mark and I met up a few weeks ago at CSU and had a fun and nuanced conversation about food, agriculture, and the climate. We started by discussing why he refers to himself as a carbon accountant, and he offers an excellent explanation of soil's all-important role in balancing the release and capture of carbon on planet Earth. We talk about how grasslands, jungles, and mangroves sequester carbon, and how and why the destruction of these ecosystems negatively affects the planet. We discuss Mark's 10-year process of writing the book and how Patagonia Books helped him to bring his vision to life. We talk about how methane is produced by everything from reservoirs to ruminants, and why that particular greenhouse gas is more harmful than others. We talk about regenerative agriculture, meat production, composting, and personal diet choices, and Mark offers a long list of excellent book recommendations. We barely scratched the surface of all the fascinating topics in the Blue Plate, so if you enjoy this conversation, I'd encourage you to pick up a copy of the book and dig in. I know you'll enjoy it and learn a lot. Thanks so much for listening. All right, Mark, we've been sitting here and I've been going on and on and on and on about how much I love your book, and I really loved it. I mean, and I read so many books now, so many great books, and obviously if I'm talking to somebody on the podcast, I really enjoyed their book. But as I was telling you before we started, I can't remember the last time a book spurred me to take action very quickly, almost in like an excited kind of I need to hurry up state of mind. And your book did that to me. And then the other thing that I didn't tell you just a second ago is that I feel like because of all this election craziness in the news and how negative everything is, for the last maybe like week and a half, I've been in a surprising funk. And reading your book, despite how serious the issues are it talks about, it spurred me to action and it made me feel better. So forget the book, forget all that. You're like a psychologist or something. You help me get out of my own head. So thank you. But we're here at CSU and you're nice enough to take the time to chat with me, and I appreciate it. In the intro, I would have talked a bit about your background, but I wonder if you could just kind of describe your work, because I love the way that you describe what you do, and maybe just kind of talk a bit about your academic life, if you don't mind.
Yeah, and it's really great to be here with you, Ed. Thank you for the kind invitation.
Oh yeah,
So I've been working as I describe myself as a greenhouse gas accountant, and I've been working in that space for about 25 years. And I started here at CSU. It came in to work in the research lab of Keith Postgen. That was about 1999. And Keith and his colleagues at this lab here called the Natural Resource Ecology Lab, they were tasked with a really interesting problem. It's something that had never been done before. And that was to try to add up, essentially do an inventory of what the what the greenhouse gas emissions were from agriculture, and looking at specific sector of agriculture, looking at the way we grow crops, the way we graze livestock, and not just that, but how land use changes, how you see cropland and pastures, they get developed all the time around the country, and what are the consequences of that for the atmosphere and for the climate when we take a cornfield or a wheat field and turn it into a subdivision or a strip mall, something like that. And Keith and a bunch of his colleagues had been working on trying to understand, well, how do we do this inventory through the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change.
Okay.
And they'd worked up some methods and worked up some techniques and some models. And then time came around and, okay, it's time to do it. We've got to try and give it a try here. And the U.S. was really on the bleeding edge of doing that at the time. U.S. and some countries in Western Europe and Australia and Japan, some other places.
And what year was this? I'm sorry.
This was 1999.
Okay.
Yeah. And Keith needed somebody to help support that effort. And I have a background in engineering, a graduate degree in ecology, and so I understood plant physiology and also understood how to manage data, how to move data around, how to write models, and that sort of thing. And so I came in and worked with him and with another scientist who's now moved up in the Agricultural Research Service, Marlon Eve, and Stephen Ogle, who was a postdoc at the time and now has moved up in that space, and Bill Parton, and a lot of other people. And we attempted to build this inventory, and a way to think about greenhouse gas accounting, in short, is there's a lot of parallels to business accounting. Yeah. You've got, what you're trying to do is add up the carbon and the nitrogen in the ecosystem and where it's moving. And it's a lot like how money moves in a business. You've got a savings account, you've got income coming in, and you've got expenses going out. And for a business to do well, you want to have a good savings account. You want to have capital available so you can invest in people and tech and marketing and also to help weather the downturns. And that's a lot like carbon and nitrogen and ecosystems. And you want to make sure that the income is balanced with the expenses. And ecosystems are there's a lot of parallels between that and how ecosystems work. The more, within reason, the more carbon you have in an ecosystem and the more nitrogen on balance, you don't want too much. The better ecosystems are able to weather the storms, literally the storms. Fields of wheat and corn, pastures that we graze livestock on, where we raise tomatoes, all of these things. They're so much like a business. The more carbon you have as organic matter and the other associated nutrients that are there, the more healthy, the more highly functioning that pasture or that field is going to be. And you want to make sure that the carbon coming in balances the carbon going out. And really for thousands of years, the agricultural model has been to actually mine that carbon and that nitrogen, to basically mine those resources. And you end up having to subsidize the ecosystem, the tomato field or the pasture, with, lately it's been synthetic chemicals. It's been ammonium nitrate and urea and other sorts of fertilizers, or bringing in livestock manure, those sorts of things. What we've been trying to do in the greenhouse gas inventory is trying to understand what that carbon is coming in, what that nitrogen is coming into the system, but then what are the emissions that come from that? And it turns out it's a really big deal. It's when we add up all of that along with everything else and looking at it from the perspective of what we call a cradle to grave livestock, or a cradle to grave life cycle inventory, from the very beginning. If you're growing wheat, for example, what are the emissions required to manufacture the equipment required to plant the wheat, to grow the seed, to manufacture the chemicals and the fertilizer that often goes into growing these products, plant the stuff, manage it, apply the chemicals, harvest the wheat, and then ship the wheat, process it into flour or whatever else it might become, into pasta, bake the bread, cook the pasta or whatever you're making the product with, and then deal with the leftovers. And then you extend that to every other food item on the planet. It adds up to about a quarter or more of the total greenhouse gas emissions that are human caused. And I think that's just fascinating. And what we found studying this thing in the process of developing the inventories is that the majority of those emissions don't come from fossil fuels. They come from microbes. Mm-hmm. And that's just one of the most, I think, fascinating fields of research right now in ecology and biogeochemistry.
Well, I feel like your ability in the book to do these analogies, like we were talking about my background before we started, and I was a MBA student in a different life. And maybe that's why I finally was able to understand this whole carbon cycle thing, because it's embarrassing to admit, especially since I have this podcast and I've worked in the conservation field for as long as I have, but I never fully understood the whole carbon cycle thing. Mm-hmm. I mean, I'm not saying I fully understand it now, but after reading your book and the way you describe it, it's the first time that I've really felt like I understand it, and I understand why plowing fields is not great, and understand why having cover crops is very important. I mean, like even today when I was driving up here, I saw this brand new subdivision or something being put in where there used to be a bunch of grassland, and they were literally digging up the grass. And I was like, oh my God, I could like see the carbon coming out. But for people who are like me, and I'll often think, this is a very selfish project, this because I'm just asking what the questions I have, but it turns out I think a lot of people have similar questions, because I think as deeply immersed in the conservation world as I am, and I didn't fully understand it, I'm guessing a lot of other people don't as well. So could you give us an overview? And again, people need to buy the book and just read that, but give an overview of how soil holds in this carbon, and then how the carbon ends up being released. Because if we go back to your analogy about a business, right now we're in heavy expenses without much revenue and without much savings, or the savings is being depleted very quickly. Yeah. So can you talk about just how much carbon is actually being held in the soil? I think, what did you call it? The excited skin of the earth. Yeah. The excited skin of the planet.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's a metaphor that a soil scientist named Nickoroff came up with. And I'm so grateful for that.
I love it. It's perfect.
It really is.
I didn't know what it meant when I first started the chapter. I was like, I wonder what that means. And then it becomes very clear. Yeah. So can you just, if you wouldn't mind, just give us put on your college professor hat and give us freshmen an understanding of what's going on there.
Yeah, I'll give it my best shot here. So, being accountants, greenhouse gas accountants, we love to count things up. We want to know where things are. And like a business accountant wants to know where the money is and what the flow is. Greenhouse gas accountants, we want to know where the carbon and the nitrogen are in the Earth system. And there's a number of sort of major pools, and the largest is the ocean, and it's carbon dioxide and carbonates and other things in the ocean. But the second largest is actually the soil of the earth, and I just think that's just fascinating. And it's not very deep. It's a meter or two, maybe 3 meters deep, depending on what the ecosystem is. And it's only just a few percent of the soil in that excited skin is actually contains organic matter, and carbon is about it makes up more than half of the what's in the organic matter. But I think it's just fascinating. And then the next largest are the atmosphere and the forests and the other plants in the Earth system. And one of the things that there's a really interesting and I think really important story about how carbon accumulates in the soil. And it goes back to when soil first forms. And before soil becomes soil, it's actually rock. It's just pulverized rock. And it might be sand or silt or clay that gets washed in or gets blown in and somehow gets deposited in a place there. And then some plant, but it's just rock. It's not soil. Mm-hmm. And you might think about it as mud. And then some plant seed gets blown in and it germinates there. And then some other plants come in, and maybe those plants, they find just enough resources to be able to produce some seeds, and then they'll seed in the place. And before long, you've got plants growing.
Yep.
And you've got, maybe it's a prairie or a wetland or a forest or whatever the ecosystem is. And carbon starts to accumulate in the soil there. Or in that pulverized rock. But it takes literally thousands of years for that carbon to build up. It doesn't happen overnight. And if we go out to virtually any soil here, outside here on the Colorado State University campus or anywhere else, and you dig up a handful of soil, we're able to date the carbon that's in that soil. You'd probably find some molecules from those very first plants.
Really?
That some of that carbon persists in the soil but it literally goes back thousands of years for the carbon in that soil to accumulate. And it's done in a really tight in synchrony between the plants and microbes in the soil. Microbes, they just like the microbes in our guts, microbes work very closely with plants. They essentially they mediate the transfer of nutrients from soil into the plants, and then in return, the plants actually feed the microbes. They take some of the material that they photosynthesize and they turn that into food. It's this mucus-like substance. We call it exudates, and it oozes out of the roots, and they feed the microbes in exchange for the services that the microbes are providing. And one of the things that the microbes do in that process is that they're capturing and they're transmogrifying that organic matter, and they're turning it into something that can persist in the soil. And they're attaching it to clay particles, and they're also building up. The microbes live and die, and their microbe bodies start to accumulate, and so that it slowly builds up. This organic matter from the plants slowly builds up in the soil, but it literally takes thousands of years for it to reach this point where the quantity is large, and we call it the soil carbon vault. And that's a metaphor that my colleague Francesca Catrufo talks about. And recommend this wonderful podcast, or I'm sorry, it's not a podcast, but this wonderful presentation she did for the Land Institute a few years ago. It builds up, and that's the savings account, that soil carbon vault. That's the savings account that basically drives and supports the ecosystem, keeps the plants alive, helps the plants weather, drought and flood and whatever might be going on. And interestingly, helps the more of that organic matter you have in the soil, the more water the soil can hold, the better water from snowmelt and rainstorms infiltrates into the soil. So it infiltrates better, and then the soil holds more of it. It's just really fascinating, this service that all this organic matter has. But then if you come along, you've got this tremendous resource, and then if you plow that soil or you overgraze it severely, you're going to start losing that organic matter into the atmosphere.
So the way I think about it is like, you got this beautiful thing about Eastern Colorado,
Mm-hmm.
where, when you talk about Eastern Colorado, your great grandmother's farm, which we can talk about, but these beautiful grasslands, all this carbon's been being stored in there over thousands of years. Yeah. Another thing I learned from your book, the Nebraska sand hills. I didn't know why it was called that, and now I do because of your book. But people need to read to learn that. But so you've got this grassland, and then people came through, in the 20s or whatever, plowed it up, and it's almost like popping a balloon in a way. I mean, just the carbon literally just leaks out. There's a part in the book where you say you wish you could see it, like visibly see the colors, because you would see carbon just going up in the atmosphere. Almost, I mean, is it equivalent to like carbon in a way coming out of an exhaust pipe of a car kind of thing?
Yeah, that's a good way to think about it. Maybe not at the same rates,
Sure.
but there's a steady stream of carbon when you plow these grasslands, or to convert them over to a wheat field, or you come in and you start and you graze it too hard for too long, you start losing that carbon out of the soil. And this is something that my colleague Melanie Hartman at the NRAL where I worked, she did this wonderful study with a group of other people where they basically tried to add up what the carbon loss from the Great Plains was in the rush to basically the homesteading process.
Yes.
It converted it from one of the largest, most diverse grassland ecosystems on the planet at the time, just in a few decades, to one of the largest agricultural complexes in the world. And in that process, they released literally billions of tons of carbon.
And basically drained the carbon account.
Exactly.
And, if you think about Eastern Colorado versus, say, the rainforest in Brazil, there's a lot, it's a lot smaller savings account, correct? Of carbon?
Actually, it's not. It's fascinating.
Really?
Yeah. Grasslands hold more carbon in the soil than most other ecosystems. The only exceptions might be mangrove swamps and other
yeah. I remember that
swamps
from the book.
Yeah. And then there's obviously a lot of carbon held in the forests of the Amazon, but not a whole lot more in total when you add up the carbon in the soil and the carbon in the forest there. It's comparable to what you see in grasslands, but it's the same process. You come in, you clear that forest, and then you convert it over to grow soybeans or to raise livestock on. You've got this big pulse of carbon that comes off. And something I want to emphasize, what people were doing at the time, without being an apologist, people were just trying to live a good life.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, they were they were doing what everybody else did. And they certainly understood that when you come in and you plowed a grassland, you had a great crop for 5, 10, maybe 15 years. And then things would slowly steadily, the yields would decline. And then eventually you reach a point where you had to start adding nutrients, whether it was guano from birds or bringing livestock manure in, and eventually when chemical fertilizers became available, that was the only way. You had to subsidize that ecosystem with added nutrients because you'd burn through the soil carbon vault.
Well, I talked to a lot of historians on this podcast, and there's a term, I think I heard Hampton Sides use it the first time, he calls it presentism, and you don't want to judge people in the past by our standards in the present.
Yeah.
And I think, and that's one of the things that I absolutely loved about your book, is that sometimes climate change type books can be, I see, maybe I've got low self-confidence or something, but they come off to me as like preachy, or you're bad because you do this. And I feel like your book, there's no judgment to it. It's actually optimistic, I think, in so many ways, but it presents these things in a way, first of all, that makes somebody like me be able to understand it. But then there's no judgment on people from the past, the homesteaders who came out here trying to, escaping these awful cities on the East Coast, trying to make a life for themselves, doing the best they could, but they didn't know.
Yeah.
It's like if we got all over some doctor from the 1850s who didn't understand bacteria. It's like, well, what's he supposed to do? We didn't know. And now we do.
That was something I worked hard to do, to just sort of celebrate the heroes and the heroines in this process of what people are doing through regenerative agriculture and other things to make a better life for themselves and reduce the emissions that come from their systems, and in some cases, they're able to reverse the emissions and store more carbon back in the soil and in the ecosystem than was there before.
Well, speaking of that, I'd love to hear how and when you decided to write this book, because it is I'm struggling with my own writing project now. And so when I read books like yours, I'm like, I can never do this. It's hopeless. But it's such it's the culmination of decades of your professional work and knowledge. Mm. But it's also, it's written in such a inviting way that I think the audience could be anybody. It's not at all it's full of figures and academics, and thanks to Patagonia Books, resources and generosity is full of all these amazing charts that really help somebody like me. But I just want, when did this first come to your mind? It's I need to put this into the world.
Yeah. Thank you so much. And by the way, I hope you're able to write that book, because I think you've got a lot of good things to say.
Mm. I can say them. I can't write them though.
So, it came about just initially through a conversation with my colleague, Sue Ellen Campbell.
Okay.
She's a professor of English here at CSU. She studied and taught environmental writing. She's a writer herself. She has 2 books out and contributed to many, many other things. And she and I were walking across the campus one day, and this recent study had come out. I think it was from the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. It's, a much lauded scientific journal. And it was about basically the state of the climate. And it was an excellent piece of science, and it was highly well-cited, transparent about the methods. They had explained it well to the scientific community, but they had completely failed in trying to explain the significance of the work to the public. They had a media advisory that came out, and it was filled with jargon, and nobody outside of, the scientists that had collaborated on this and other people it was written for in the scientific community really understood what it meant. And I was walking along with Sue Ellen, and she said to me, "You scientists, you screw this up every chance you get." And she was right. The scientific community had been struggling for a long time, since James Hansen and others first went to Congress to try to talk about climate change and try to raise public awareness about it, raise awareness within policymakers and governance about the importance of the issue. The scientific community was really struggling with, okay, how do we talk about this to the public in a way that the public understands? And to be fair, to my colleagues and everybody else who, came before me and has been working with me for the last few decades, we were struggling enough to try to understand the science ourselves, because we felt this, incredibly urgent need to respond to the commitment that the countries of the world had made to each other to count up greenhouse gas emissions and report them in this transparent way to each other and say, these are what our emissions are, and this is what we think we can do about them. And so oftentimes within the scientific community, reporting that back to the public, ultimately our constituents, our stakeholders, was secondary. And so I realized Sue Ellen was right. And in this field that I worked in, the public at that time was starting to understand that when you burn stuff, you burn coal, natural gas, gasoline, oil, it's going to create pollution that could heat the climate. But trying to explain how microbes worked and what the role of microbes was, and that they were producing literally, hundreds of millions of tons every year of carbon pollution that was heating the climate, just because of the way we grew our food, the way we manage our livestock, the way we manage land use. That was, nobody had attempted to try to explain that beyond some journalists who made a really good effort. Kristen Olson wrote that book, The Soil Will Save Us.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. And there was a group called Kiss the Ground. And
yeah,
so
sure.
People were really starting to take it seriously. And I realized, I took a poll amongst my colleagues and, hey, is anybody doing this? And nobody was. And I thought, well, okay, I guess it's going to be me.
Did you feel like it's the kind of thing where you're like, I have to do this.
Mm-hmm.
Because that's what I've heard with a lot of writers is the idea becomes a book when there's no other choice.
Yeah. My writing mentor, John Calderazzo, describes it as this thing grabs you by the neck with its teeth and shakes you. Mm-hmm. And you just can't free yourself of it until you write it down. And that's how I felt. And it just grabbed hold of me. I felt the urgency of it, but I'd been reading, I love good writing. I love good books, and I really appreciate when, especially good science writing, when people are able to take an issue and explain it well, but also make it personal. Where it's not a textbook where they've embodied whatever this is. It's a part of their life, and they talk about, the connection it has to them and the way they live their life, their community, whatever it is. I've been fascinated by and a big fan of that kind of writing. And I realized if I'm going to succeed, I need to learn how to write well. I need to, go back to the masters like, Rachel Carson and Aldo Leopold.
Sure.
And others, E.O. Wilson.
Mm-hmm.
And, look at those, Barbara Kingsolver, and think about, okay, what can I learn from how they do these things? And how they, make these connections to people's lives. And I felt ultimately that was the challenge. The science, explaining the science was almost secondary, but trying to find the story and the connections was really, really important to me.
It's two separate skill sets. I think about one of my friends, a good buddy, actually had the misfortune of having a brain tumor that he was able to get through fine, but he had to go to like the best neurosurgeon in the country to get it out of his brain. And the guy was a complete oddball weirdo, like had handlers around him who would do the talking for him because he was the best at this. But the bedside manner, that's a different skill set. and nobody really cared because it's like you talked about at the beginning, with your colleagues, we were just trying to solve this problem. There's not time right now to try to explain it. But I feel like you've got this unbelievable expertise in this subject. And then you've also got the ability to tell the story. And I was sure when I was reading this and getting ready for the interview, I was like, maybe I've missed something. I'm sure this guy's written many, many books. And I went to Amazon because I just can't believe that you didn't crank it. It's not like you cranked it out in a year. I mean, this took a long time.
Yeah.
Can you talk about that?
Sure. Yeah, it was a 10-year process.
God, that's so amazing. I've had this podcast for 8.5 years.
Yeah. And I was writing after 5 and weekends. I'm not on the teaching faculty here. I'm a grant-funded research scientist, and so there's surprisingly for people who are not part of teaching faculties, there's not a lot of resources out there for scientists to apply for funding to write books. And besides that, I was part of an effort where I felt a great sense of urgency and talk with the research team, and we realized I can't step away from what I'm doing for a year or two and do this. I needed to try and do it in parallel. So it was just grabbing time on weekends, time in evenings when, the beast was shaking me. And I realized I've got to get this down. And then a few wonderful writing retreats, about 3 of them where I was able to devote a week, and then eventually when I was able to get connected with an agent and Patagonia Books extended the invitation to contribute a manuscript, then I was able to find the time to pull it all together and submit it. And that was the 7.5-year process. And then it was about 2 years from signing the contract to the point where the book came out.
Wow.
Which is relatively consistent for books like this. They put so much time and effort into design. It also went through an extensive peer review process, which I was really grateful for. And there was a lot to it. If I had to do it over again, I might have tried to step away from my work and try to get it all down in a year or two.
Really?
And hand it off, yeah. But just because the stories remain I think they continue to be relevant. I'm grateful that you think that they are, but also the research is so fast paced right now. Things our understandings are improving so quickly now, and I'm already starting to think about, wow, I need to revise that because we know something new about that.
Yeah, well, I mean, good for people like me. That means you have to write more books, and I get to read them. So, no, I remember I mentioned this earlier before we started recording, but I was in Ventura and got to visit with Carla at Patagonia Books, and it was probably a year and a half ago now. But she was telling me about this book before it was actually in. Maybe you had just turned in the final manuscript, and it just sounded fascinating. And I knew that you lived right up the road. And then, as things happen, my brain gets full of all this other stuff. And then the book arrived. I was like, oh, I remember all this. And so I'm really glad that it all came around. And again, I think people who listen to the podcast, that some of them might think that I'm like so enthusiastic and but in real life, I can be kind of grumpy and kind of jaded on certain things. And so you can ask, we should call my wife right now because she was around as I was reading this book, and it made me, it just brought a lot of, like I said, it led me to take action, which I think is the best thing a book can do, I think. Two more kind of technical things that I did not understand that your book really helped me. Can you define the three different categories of what greenhouse gases are? Because I didn't know that.
Okay.
Maybe I knew, but I didn't know like I know now.
First of all, I'm just humbled to hear you say that it had an impact on you. Thank you for saying that.
Oh, sure.
I'm grateful for that.
I don't know if I said this on the recording, but I'm composting again as of last night, and I'm going to get some chickens in my backyard. That's not a direct suggestion from your book, but as I was on the last chapter, I had this vision of a chicken coop and having my own eggs. So,
oh, wonderful.
I don't know. I might be blaming you. I might not be thanking you. I might be blaming you when those chickens run wild.
They can be a little bit like boats, I hear.
Yeah. My granddad had a boat, and he called it the Pickpocket. That was his name because it just took all his money.
Yeah, the second happiest day of your life is the day you get the chickens. The happiest day is the day you sell them.
worth a shot. It'll be a funny story regardless.
But the different greenhouse gases that I talk about in the book, there's three main ones that come from agriculture. And there's other really important ones, but these are the big kahunas. And so carbon dioxide is the biggest one. And the most important sources in agriculture are from burning fossil fuels, but more importantly, produced from soils and also from forests and grasslands. When you take a forest and you say, I'm going to grow soybeans there, or I'm going to clear the forest and I'm going to turn it to pasture and I'm going to grow, and I'm going to raise cattle there. There's a lot of carbon dioxide that comes off, hundreds of tons that come from every acre, when you do something like that, or that can be hundreds of tons. And there's other sources of carbon dioxide, but those are the big ones. The second two are methane and nitrous oxide. And the two of those, I want to talk about methane first. It's probably the most important one that we should be paying attention to right now. And methane comes from, it comes basically wherever you've got organic matter in a moist environment and there's no oxygen, little to no oxygen. The microbes go crazy with the organic matter. They consume it as food, but since they don't have oxygen, they can't produce carbon dioxide as a waste product, just like we do. They have an alternative pathway where they can continue to live and metabolize, eat that organic matter, but their waste product is methane. And the reason methane is so important right now is because it has a very strong climate heating effect. In the short term, Methane lives in the atmosphere for about 12 years before it's eventually degraded. And in that time period, it has like 80 to 100 times the warming effect of an equivalent amount of carbon dioxide had.
80 to 100 times.
80 to 100 times, yeah. And most of that effect, 3/4 of that effect, is felt in the first like 6 years of its life in the atmosphere. And so and methane concentrations in the atmosphere are rising right now at an alarming rate. And a lot of it is coming from the ecosystem, from agriculture and from melting permafrost and from wetlands, other places. And there's tremendous concern right now that there could be what we call a methane feedback loop, where methane warms the climate, which begets more methane from the ecosystem, which warms the climate, and it continues on. If that becomes runaway, it's a grave concern, and its scientific community has been talking about that for almost 50 years now.
And is that specifically like the main culprit there in a feedback loop would be glaciers melting?
Well, that's a really significant one, because you lose the reflectance of the ice. The ice is very white and it reflects. Yeah. And so rather than heat being reflected back into space, it gets absorbed by the Earth system.
And then it's hotter, so more. Then it continues to recede, and then just more and more and more. Is that right? There's an important feedback loop there. You also have, in the northern climates, you have less snow when the climate's warmer, and so you get less of that reflectance that comes. The snow melts earlier in the spring, mm-hmm. and so you have more of the heat's getting absorbed. But the bigger thing here is that it's So those are some of the effects. Also, you losing the polar ice, and this is something that people scientific community has been talking about for decades now. Concerned that if we lose the polar ice cap, we lose all the reflectance that ice provided. That heat is being absorbed by the oceans rather than being reflected back to space, and that happens for 24 hours a day for months at a time during the polar summer. So tremendous concerns about that, and it's all part of the Earth system. Rob Jackson, in his recent book Into the Clear Blue Sky, he talks about how he feels like the most important thing we can do right now is try to get our methane emissions under control. And the big ones from agriculture are they're coming from the guts of animals, principally from ruminants like cattle and sheep, and it's microbes that are, in a symbiotic way, they're digesting grass for cattle and sheep and other ruminants and turning it into food that the cattle and sheep can actually digest and utilize. And that's an evolutionary relationship that goes back tens of millions of years, goes back to the dinosaurs. Oh, yeah.
And then also, not just from there, from dairy lagoons, manure lagoons. Most modern dairies have a lagoon where wet manure gets stored, and it's a giant methane factory. Fascinatingly, this was a journal discovery for me. It turns out that reservoirs, irrigation, municipal water reservoirs. That
part was fascinating, the part where you held a lighter?
Yeah.
Was that at Lake Mead?
It was at Lake Mead.
Yeah.
No, not Lake Mead, Lake Powell.
Lake Powell. Can you tell that story?
Sure. So I was on a raft trip down Cataract Canyon, and it was our last night of the trip, and it was our last camp, and we were actually on the Colorado River, but it was the portion of the river where it becomes the upper end of Lake Powell. Lake Powell was receding at the time, and it still is. It's just there's not enough water in the river system to fill the reservoir, and there's these mud banks, sandbanks that were starting to form as the reservoir. There's all this sediment that the river had been dumping in this space, and as that water recedes and exposes these banks, these sediment piles, the microbes really go to work on the organic matter in all these sediments. And if you go online and look at this, there's these methane volcanoes.
Wow. That
people are finding and throughout, not just Lake Powell, but other places. And I found a small one of these, and I'm sitting there just enjoying a beer and listening to the birds call, the canyon wrens, and I grabbed my lighter out of my ditty bag, my 10 essentials, and I went and I'd found one of these things that was just popping, and I held the lighter over when I thought the thing might pop, and it popped, and there's a brief flash of blue, and it was methane coming out from that, and it's fascinating, and that process contributes so much methane to the atmosphere that is currently uncounted. It's important that it be counted, but this is one of those things that the scientific community is just starting to grapple with, and there's tremendous consequences for this, because there's a lot of agencies and institutions feel some urgency about developing more water resources, but it's clear now that it would come at a cost to the climate. And there was very careful about that.
There was one part where because in my conservation work I used to do, it was all about irrigated farmland. So that was one thing that I dug pretty deeply into, and was so every step of the way, I was so surprised by just what the massive plumbing system that is the American West. But there was a part in the book, I believe, where you said there's been some studies that show that you may actually lose more water from evaporation than actually gets used downstream is that true? I mean, did I summarize that correctly?
Yeah. Isn't that fascinating? There's some reservoirs that, because the climate has changed and because of just incomplete accounting before they built the reservoirs, that they actually lose more water from the system than they save, than they capture and deliver in their pipelines. And and those problems have, just most recently starting to be recognized. And fortunately, some of those reservoirs are being identified to be removed or modified in a way that corrects that issue.
Sure.
I think it's fascinating.
And speaking of methane, we can't not talk about cows. And I was curious, obviously we can talk about all the details, but I was more curious about how you felt about writing that chapter, just because it is such like everything, I guess, but it really brings out big time emotions in people.
Yeah.
And I felt like the way you opened the chapter, was actually, can I read that real quick?
Yeah.
Cause I felt like the way you opened the chapter, you said, society and science are meeting on a playing field of meat in a debate rivaling some of the greatest science and culture debates in history. No other food item seems to intersect the climate crisis more than meat. Raising meat, and especially meat from cattle, sheep, and goats, creates more emissions by a factor of between 10 and 50 than any other food source except shrimp farmed in clear-cut mangrove forest. Pitched battles rage throughout the culture wars, creating a confusing space where almost anybody can find evidence to support their positions. People feel their livelihoods are threatened. Accusations fly, motives are questioned. Questions abound. Is grass-fed meat better for the climate? Can livestock be fed seaweed to reduce their emissions? Should the world give up eating meat altogether? And I thought that was a really great way to start the chapter, just by acknowledging like this makes people very angry. And so what was your thought about putting forth the chapter like that? But because I feel like you said, there are so many people, whatever you want to believe, you can find evidence to support that.
Yeah. Yeah. That was the hardest chapter for me to write, to be
really
honest with you. And thank you for reading that.
I should have had you read it instead of my dumbass Eastern North Carolina accent.
No, it was great to hear it reflected back to me. And that introduction, that actually reflected some of my own personal conflict about the issue. I'm a child of the Great Plains. I grew up in Nebraska, and I grew up eating meat 3 times a day.
Sure.
And like a lot of people do. And it's such a part, and this is something I try to talk about in the chapters. It's such a part of our, my personal family history. And I realized I'm not unique in that. It's just something that all my friends, all my colleagues, are, having the same experiences. And you go out to eat, and it's, what are we going to do? We're going to celebrate. Let's get a steak. Oh my God, it's prime rib night.
Oh yeah.
These sorts of things. And these things are just such a part of our lives. And I realized I wanted to explore my own, for lack of a better way to talk about it, explore my own feelings and what my own journey had been, and also what it meant for me going forward in trying to live a good life, what my relationship to meat was going to be about. And I realized, well, that is probably going to be, that's something I need to pay attention to.
Sure.
Because otherwise it's going to end up sounding like a textbook. But also as an ecologist, looking at ecosystems, I don't know if there are any ecosystems out there that don't have grazers in some form, whether it's grasshoppers or insects or the below ground microbes and other organisms that I described that feed on plant roots and the exudates and all that stuff, all the way up to the four-legged, elk and bison and cattle and sheep and whatever it might be. All of these ecosystems have grazers. And I also came to realize through the research that there's a lot of places in the world where people live, that if they're going to eat locally and if they're going to live sustainably, the only thing that they can reliably raise there is going to be livestock, whether it's for meat or for dairy, or in some cases for, literally for the blood, that they harvest from the animals, these sorts of things. Also, that there's other parts of agriculture that really rely on ruminants and poultry. We rely on the manure to fertilize, for example. It's really important for a lot of organic cropping systems, not just organic, but a lot of others. And also discovering that when we bring livestock back into cropping systems, right now, the way we raise livestock, we've got this model where we raise the forage in one place and we feed them somewhere else.
Yes.
Sometimes it's hundreds to thousands of miles away from those things. Separation between the food source, the forage for the livestock, and the actual animals themselves. Bringing them back into cropping systems there's research that's starting to show that actually can accelerate this process of carbon drawdown.
Sure.
Bringing carbon from the atmosphere back into the soil where it's been lost, but also at the same time reducing the need for chemical fertilizers and other sorts of maybe herbicides, and also producing healthier animals, healthier meat. Animals can be raised in a way that really avoid a lot of the problems with the CAFO model, the concentrated animal feeding operation model, which has so many environmental consequences. We can avoid those in a way. So ultimately, what I came down to was that it's not just a matter of giving up meat completely. The problem is a lot more complicated than that. And it's something that I feel like we need to pay attention to. But ultimately, we're at a point now, we're probably at a point where we're at, or we maybe should have passed peak meat a while ago. Because raising meat, especially ruminants, requires so much land. Compared with just raising human food. It requires, 3 to 3.5 times more acreage to raise the forage needed to feed livestock and in exchange for the protein and other nutrients that come from that. Whereas a plant-based diet, much, much less land required for humans. And in order to, if the demand for meat is going to continue to grow, for society as a whole, the only way we can produce that forage is to clear more forests and plow more grasslands to create the cropland, to create the forage that these animals need. And at the same time, the scientific community is is pretty clear. The evidence points to no, that's actually the opposite. We actually need to be reforesting areas that have already been lost and protecting forest and grassland ecosystems for biodiversity, for to protect water resources, maintain water quality, improve water quality, all these other benefits that come from that. And that was, personally, it was difficult, to confront that and think about my own legacy. And I had to give myself love and grant myself some grace to say, look, buddy, you didn't know.
Yeah.
And here you are. So living a good life going forward, what are the decisions you're going to make?
Which I think one of the things I really appreciated about the way you explored that subject is that you made it very clear it is complicated. It's interesting now we have unlimited information at our fingertips, and we should be able to appreciate the nuance of things, but I think it's out of fear. People were just cowering and just saying yes, no, right, wrong, good, bad, meat bad, or meat is the best. And I think what you show is that it's very, very complicated on a lot of levels, from scientific down to emotional, down to cultural. Tell me if you disagree with this, but it seems to me that it's less of a cow and a methane problem and more of a business demand creation problem. Like, I feel like if there was not this demand, if there was not this ridiculous demand for meat, everybody in the world thinks that they can eat hamburgers for 3 meals a day. If there was just if there was less meat being demanded, I feel like there's probably some carrying capacity. If you take the amount of grasslands that have been historically used as grassland, whether by bison or whatever, and you responsibly graze those grasslands, and there's some number in there to where it works. Right. But it seems to me that there's just too many people want to eat beef.
That the demand is strong. It's and as people in developing nations become more wealthy, we see this trend. And this, I'm just reporting the data. I'm not blaming them.
No, yeah.
Because if I was in their shoes, I might feel very much the same way. It's a high value caloric resource. It's also delicious for a lot of people.
I love it.
People value it. Yeah. And so as standard of living increases, people tend towards who might have been on a 100% or largely plant-based diet, largely because of, lack of money, lack of resources. They tend to want more meat. And as the population grows, human population around the world grows, and as people become more affluent, which is a good thing, people coming out of poverty, the trend is to want more meat. And that we're not, I don't know how we're going to grapple with this problem, to be honest with you.
The analogy that came to my mind when I was thinking about this is that it's like a kid that was born into a very, very wealthy family, like 3 or 4 generations down from whoever created the wealth, born to this massive trust fund. And then all of a sudden the money starts running out. They're spendthrift, they're idiot, whatever. They don't responsibly steward the money that they've been given. It's gone, or it becomes clear it's going to be gone pretty soon, and they have to start making cuts. Oh, I guess I got to sell the beach house. Oh, I guess I got to, kids aren't going to private school anymore, that kind of thing. And I feel like that's kind of where we are. We all inherited this amazing planet that's provided beyond anything we could ever ask for. But now it's become clear, like, it's running dry, and there have to be some cuts made, and it's not going to be pleasant.
We have to be careful. Although I can say in my own life, so I get about 5% of my calories from animal-based foods now. Yeah, and so I've changed. Part of that is dietary reasons. I've just learned, in the last few years that I just don't tolerate dairy anymore, and so
that's interesting.
And that was really hard for me because I just, the cheeses of the world are just so amazing.
It's clear you love food in this book,
And so I can still enjoy a little bit of it, and now and then, but I've also cut back on the meat, and part of that is because most of the meat that's available, over 90% of it, comes out of the CAFO model. And I just don't feel personally like I can support that anymore, just because of all the other consequences for water quality, for animal welfare, for tremendous concerns medical community has been raising about the use of antibiotics and what that means for us, and all these other things. And so, I'm somebody who's lucky that here in Fort Collins, I have access to, pasture raised poultry, and I can get, grass fed, butter. That's something I can still eat. And so when I do eat meat, it's those things. Or animal products, it's those things. But I also have I love food. My mom started teaching me to cook when I was 7, and I've been cooking ever since then on her model. And I've just also learned, I've embraced plant-based foods honestly, it doesn't feel like I'm losing anything anymore. It feels like just the whole world has been opened up to me, all the different cultures out there where those opportunities are. And to be honest with you, I feel better.
Do you really? That's what I was going to ask, how you feel.
I'm healthier now. Just over the last year, my weight is down, and I'm able to ski and backpack and do all these things into my 60s that I've been doing for, since I was in my 20s. And I found that once I embraced the largely plant-based diet, that actually facilitated that. It actually became easier in a lot of ways.
There's a part at the very end of the book, a sentence that really stuck out to me, where I think you say it may be a quote from somebody else, but you say this, in the end, this shouldn't have to boil down to being a personal consumer choice, because everything we're talking about, we're in a very privileged position to even be able to think about that. Like now, one of the other action items I want to do is I want to get my meat from ranches where, I know where it came from.
Yeah.
And, or even better, like my friend Matt Skoglund, who runs North Bridger Bison, right. I'd love to be able to buy meat from him, because it's this self-sustaining system that's amazing all the way around, but it's super expensive.
Yeah.
And we're both, we both got advanced degrees and all this stuff, and we're sitting here at one of the world's best universities hanging out. It's one thing if we're working 3 jobs to try to get kids and we're on welfare or whatever,
Absolutely.
And so it really is there needs to be, I feel like that's what the government or whatever, there needs to be some rules, I think.
Yeah. Well, we've got the food system that we have right now is the food system that we have. And there's so much of an emphasis upon meat. And there's a whole complicated story, not just meat, but dairy products. And this is not to say that those foods are bad, but they just carry a burden now that we're starting to understand more. And we have to be more thoughtful about how we consume them and the extent that we consume them. And we have to pay attention to the dietary transition that I think is inevitable. For all these other forces that are converging right now, we have to make sure that the poor don't get left behind, the people who are struggling, the people who are unlike us, who have, access to the resources we need. We could literally go out and probably get anything that we want.
Yeah.
And we've got to pay attention to the folks who don't have access to those resources and make sure that they don't get left behind. I think there's just fundamentally a justice issue there.
There is. Oh, and that's the thing is, your book focuses on ag, but it also makes it very clear how many other kind of systems are at stake, cultural, injustice, public health. Just across the board.
Yeah.
It's all connected.
Yeah. Yeah, it is.
One other technical thing that I thought that was so helpful to me. Can you give your analogy of, so we keep talking about carbon going into the air. And I was telling you in the first few pages of your book, you were talking about tons of carbon being released into the air. I'm like, what does this mean? Tons of carbon. If it's kind of like a gas, how do you tell if it's a ton, blah, blah, blah. And then a few paragraphs down, you explain it in an analogy. So I finally understand what a ton of carbon means. Can you explain that for people who may be as stupid as me?
Yeah. So I use, in that chapter, The Excited Skin of the Planet, I talk about the carbon in my great-grandmother Neva's field out in eastern Colorado. And hers was a sandy soil. And she had about 12 tons of carbon per acre there. And the analogy that I make there is, imagine wheelbarrows full of charcoal. And so if you've got like a wheelbarrow that you completely fill with charcoal, it might weigh about 100 pounds. And then you've got 20 wheelbarrows full of charcoal that make up a ton. And so in order to have 12 tons of carbon, and you'd have about 240 wheelbarrows full of charcoal that would be scattered evenly throughout that 1 acre of cropland out there. And that was before her soil was plowed and turned into a wheat field. And that's relatively small, because it's a sandy soil. Sandy soils don't hold nearly as much carbon as, let's say, that's in the dry, far western edge of the Great Plains, eastern Colorado, about 100 miles from the Rocky Mountains. If you go east from there to, let's say, to eastern Kansas, the border with Missouri, you've got soils there that hold a lot more, maybe 10 times as much carbon as you'd find in that, as was found in my great-grandmother Neva's field. And some fields hold quite a bit more than that. And that gets back to that story about the soil being the largest pool of carbon other than the oceans in the Earth's ecosystem. It's fascinating.
One other random question that popped in my head. When you talk about clearing forests to make grazing land, so you clear the forest, all that carbon savings account scatters, plant grass to start grazing cows. How long would it take for that new grassland? I know it varies depending on the location on that, but in general, is it 10 years or is it 1,000 years in a formerly forested area to refill the savings account with carbon with grass?
Yeah. Depending on how it's managed, it probably would lose carbon.
Really?
Compared to what it was. Yeah. And it could happen over the course of just a few decades, maybe as little as 10 years. And because typically if you go through and you clear a forest and turn it into a pasture, you're going to be grazing livestock on it. And so you've got the initial disturbance from clearing the forest. They use heavy equipment for that sort of stuff. And oftentimes it'll get burned. So you've got a big disturbance to the soil. You lose a lot of the carbon from that disturbance, just the process of it getting plowed up and trees getting dragged across it. And then you plant the grasses. It's typically a monoculture or just a few species, not nearly as productive as the extremely diverse ecosystem that was there before. You're going to have less of that carbon inputs coming back into the soil. It tends to be probably shallower rooted. And then, the livestock are going to be coming in. They're going to be taking an awful lot of that carbon off and, exporting it in their bodies. And so you've got a system there where, over the course of maybe 30 to 50 years, it will settle into a new, what we call an equilibrium state, and with probably far less carbon in the ecosystem than there would have been in that forest or whatever the native system was that the pasture replaced.
Thank you. That popped into my head a while back, and I wanted to make sure I got that. One more question. We're already well over an hour. Can you believe that? Maybe you can. I can't.
I'm loving this conversation.
To kind of end on a high note in a way that people can take action. The thing that really caught me in your book that made me take action was learning about how much impact you can have from so little effort through composting. So can you give the listeners the kind of spiel on composting and why it's so important? And again, buy the book, read it, but this is just a primer.
You bet. I'm just so delighted to hear you asking about this and what, what a role it has in your own life. It's fascinating when we throw food in the trash, it goes into the landfill and it gets buried in the depths of the landfill. And just like in the guts of animals, where methane gets produced and just in the depths of reservoirs or in those manure lagoons at dairies, the microbes go to work on it. They consume that food waste and they produce methane as a byproduct. And if you add up all the methane from all the food waste that ends up in landfills around the world, if it was its own country, it would be like the fourth largest emitter in the world. It's fascinating. And all that methane coming from landfills. And now with satellite-based sensors, we're starting to learn just how large, it's even larger than we had previously thought it might be based on just ground-based measurements. But if just the simple act of keeping the food waste and your yard waste out of the landfill, you're preventing that methane from getting produced. And it's the same as, if you've got to run a bunch of errands, rather than driving your car to one errand and back home and another errand and back home, you combine trips, or you ride your bicycle, or you walk, or you carpool to work. It's the same as not burning the gasoline. You're simply not producing the emissions that go into the atmosphere. And the other thing I think that's so heartening and so promising about the story of compost is that you layer in all these other climate benefits that come from it. The compost that gets produced from that, when it gets used to grow food or to provide nutrients or to improve pastures for livestock, you don't have to add as much of the chemical fertilizers, which are very energy intensive to produce, lots of emissions associated with that. You also are facilitating these fascinating ecosystem activities in the soil that can actually lead to greater amounts of carbon being pulled from the atmosphere into the soil. And you're also facilitating greater yields from the system. And there's just all these benefits from composting that when layered, it's fascinating. It's like 1 + 1 = 5.
Yeah. Well, it's such low effort to make that happen.
Yeah.
I mean, really, it's last night after I'd had my epiphany, I just, obviously noticed the amount of scraps of fruits and vegetables. Mm-hmm. And then, I mean, the coffee grounds, mm-hmm. Holy cow. I might have to give those, my compost heap is just going to be a coffee ground heap.
I've got the same thing going on.
Out of balance. But,
somebody calls, I can't remember who coined this term, but they call composting, recycling's final frontier. And I wish I'd written that. I just love that.
Well, it seems like, from a business perspective, that there are some people that are on the cusp of figuring out how to make money doing it. And I think ultimately, maybe that's a negative thing, but I do think it's true, is whether you're talking about land conservation, land trust, or you're talking about that, mm-hmm. The only way it's going to scale is when people can make money doing it.
Yeah.
And
I agree.
And you highlight so many people that have figured out a way to merge business with doing the right thing.
Yeah. Yeah.
And, it's like the first electric cars or whatever. It's kind of crazy, and people, there's some question of whether or not it's going to work, but those are the people that are on the front lines, and then they make it so that other, the business can go at scale. And I feel like you profile so many different people, like even some right here in this town or within 30 miles of this town doing that work.
It's fascinating. The farmers and ranchers that I met with, the waste managers, people working on policy, all of them, what they point to is that where the growers, where the people who make their living doing this thing, where it's either reducing their expenses or increasing their income or both, they're making more money doing it.
Oh yeah. Like the peach people.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it's also helping to essentially even out, the highs and the lows. It's creating more consistency in their enterprise. And, mm-hmm. It's tricky to do. It's not just something you just step into and implement. I'm going to go regenerative tomorrow. It can take years in some cases, depending on what the system is, fortunately, there's a lot of expertise out there, and it's already being done on tens of millions of acres around the world. So it's starting to scale in a really impressive way. So there's lots of resources out there, but it's also, there can be tremendous barriers for growers, especially the ones who are living, they're managing their enterprise on the margins. They're working on from a year-to-year basis, which a lot of growers economically are in that situation. Unfortunately, it's difficult for them to take the risk.
Oh, it's a tough business. When I was doing a lot of work down the lower Arkansas Valley, and you see these farmers that have been multi-generational farmers down there, and very successful for generations, but every single year their ass is on the line. It's like starting from zero, and the margins are so thin. And so it does take some kind of crazy, in the best way of thinking about it, people to push the envelope a little bit and risk.
I think that peer network, the people who have pulled it off, farmers and ranchers are some of the greatest innovators in the world.
Oh, yeah.
It's amazing how much experimentation I see on practically every operation that I get the privilege to visit. And it's that peer network that is, I think, one of the greatest resources for other farmers that want to go regenerative and try to reduce their emissions. And it's the support they get from their neighbors that really makes all the difference for them. And fundamentally as well too, let's just be clear about this. It takes money. It's there's what we found consistently is that when federal and state governments step in with resources to ease that transition, whether it's through the Natural Resources Conservation Service or, conservation districts or whatever, through programs where they cost share for several years, help with purchasing equipment, help support development equipment co-ops or seed co-ops or whatever it might be, those sorts of resources, when they're made available, the growers take advantage of them.
You've already mentioned a lot of authors that have been impactful to you. And in the book, there's so many great authors. You reference one of my favorite books ever, Cod.
Oh, yeah.
That's one of my, I think about that book constantly.
Yeah.
And I feel like your book is along those lines in that you focus on this one subject, but by focusing on this one subject and doing such a good job of explaining it, it allows me to learn about a much broader thing. And that's how cod is. It's just focused on this one fish, but you learn about even, the exploration of the Atlantic Ocean, finding the North America, the whole deal.
I'm a huge fan of that book.
Yeah. But so what books have been important to you? I know it's hard to just name a few, but it could be in your world of climate research, or it could be just in you developing as a human being. But are there any books that come to mind that have been important in your journey?
Oh, wow. That's such a wonderful question. There's so many of them. Along the lines of that deep dive into a small space, William Lee Heatmoon's book, Prairie Earth, had a big influence on me, where he went to the Flint Hills in Kansas, near where I grew up. And he spent a few years just exploring that space under the idea that if you go into a seemingly uninteresting place, it's just grassland, and spend enough time there, fascinating stories will come from it. And he definitely proved that concept. Barbara Kingsolver's writing has really stuck with me. And her book, Animal, Vegetable, Mineral.
Wife and I were talking about, my wife referenced that this morning in relation to my excitement about your book.
Oh, yeah.
She said, you should tell him that book is important to you, because it really was.
Yeah. Yeah. And I felt like, and she brings so much heart and such a strong sort of moral and ethical center, to her work. And I felt like she sort of gave me permission in a way to tap into that in this.
It shows. I can see the parallels.
Wow. Thank you. I mentioned Aldo Leopold before, Sand County Almanac. That's something that I go back to every year. It's just, and I closed the book with a scene from the shack, his farm that they've restored, and what an influence that had on me, and what a metaphor that is for us going forward into climate terra incognita, what we need to do in order to deal with that. And there's so many others. Gary Nabhan's book, Coming Home to Eat.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Which made me start to think about eating locally. Silent Spring.
That's fascinating. I interviewed Douglas Brinkley about his most recent book where he talks about Rachel Carson's influence on LBJ, JFK, Nixon.
Yeah.
I knew Silent Spring, obviously, but that book really changed history.
Yeah. You know what? And my writing mentor, John Calderazzo, and another writer that I worked with, Laura Pritchett, they really both helped me with developing this book. They both talked about what a considered approach. She didn't just sit down and write that. She thought, okay, how do I develop this story? And she spent a long time researching it and consulting with a lot of other people. She had the technical details written down, but she had to figure out, okay, how do I communicate this? And ultimately, she settled on this. It's sort of the story of a stranger comes to town, and that's how she developed it, and it's something that everybody can relate to. She did such a beautiful and critically important job with that, and it did the job. It made the work, and it's something that I thought about and trying to develop this book as well too.
Books are just so important. I think as the internet just continues to create chaos and take over, like I was talking to my daughters last night and I can't remember how it came up, but we were talking about, I think just how like over life, you want to evolve as a person. You don't want to just be the same person at age 16 as you want to constantly be evolving.
Lifelong learner.
Yeah. How do you do that? And I said, I think books are the number one way to do that. I mean, they can, and books that spur action, I mean, I think about all the things that I'm proud of that I've done. They were all spurred by a book I read. Yeah.
Books and being open to being wrong.
Yes.
Having a conversation with yourself, being confronted with, wow, I thought I knew that. And turns out I didn't.
That's what I always say when I read something or come across ideas that I don't agree with, or I think I don't agree with. I'm like, all right, worst case scenario, it bolsters what I already know. Yeah. Best case scenario, I change my mind.
Yeah.
Like how cool is that?
I love that.
I mean, I really do believe that. I mean, it's not pleasant when it happens.
Yeah.
Grinding gears a little bit. But,
yeah.
I've already taken too much of your time. This has been great. Any parting words, anything way you'd like to wrap this up? There's just, I've got 3 pages of notes here. I think I got 3 bullet points. We went through 3 bullet points. So we might have to do a part 2 at some point.
Oh, I'd love to come back, at any point. This has been just such a pleasure to talk with you. And, I'll just say when Stephanie reached out to me and told me that you had expressed interest, I was just sort of stunned. And
had you listened to the podcast before that? Like, did you know of any of this stuff beforehand?
I've listened to it. It's not my regular feed is, I'm sort of stuck on like 3 podcasts right now.
That's how I am.
And then when I go on vacation, yours is one that I pull in.
I'm ruining your vacation.
No. It's I'm either on a road trip or I'm going to be hanging out, and I've got some hours to spare. I'm going to move Ed to the top of the list. Oh man, listen to it.
That always makes me nervous when I find out smart people are listening to it. I can't believe anybody listens to it.
It's just well, I mentioned before, you've got, you do just such a generous job with the interviews, and people you bring in people who have, really interesting and thoughtful things to say. And I appreciate that. There are so many people that I admire, and it's great to have the opportunity to listen to them and hear you in conversation with them. I don't know if I have anything else to add in closing, other than this is I guess I express some gratitude to Patagonia. I couldn't have asked for a better publishing partner. They just came in to this project, and they said, we're all in. And they did a beautiful job. I felt like designing the book. My wife is a production editor, for, a publishing company, and so I had a sense for how books get built. It's not just, you hand in a manuscript and somebody turns the book crank and a book comes out. There's literally dozens of steps that go through the process, and I'd never been part of that. But Patagonia was well organized and committed and thoughtful and very engaging, and they just respected the work. And we had a great relationship. It was a great partnership all the way through, and I was so grateful for that.
They're the real deal. I say, sometimes when you get to know organizations and you scratch a little bit below the surface, you realize, oh, this isn't as great as I thought it was going to be. But I feel like I've thankfully gotten to know Patagonia pretty well over the years, and every little dig that I go deeper, I'm more impressed.
Yeah.
And it's really, it's like your book. I mean, it's inspiring. I'm always glad, like I love Patagonia clothes. I think I'm fully decked in Patagonia right now, but ultimately, like the bigger lesson for me is the inspiration that comes from that. And that, there are people that are really doing the right thing.
Yeah. And the profits from this book are going to help address the climate crisis. And I'm donating 10% of my royalties to organizations that are doing that as well too. And so I couldn't feel better about, a publishing partner.
That's great. Well, awesome job on the book. Obviously there's so much great info in there, but I think it's, like I said at the beginning, it just makes me feel better about things. Mm-hmm. And so thank you I can't imagine how challenging this thing was to get out in the world, but from my perspective, at least, it was worth all your efforts. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Just such a privilege and a pleasure to be here with you, Ed.
Hey, it's Ed again. Thanks so much for listening to the podcast. I know your time is valuable, so it means the world that you spend it listening. If you want to support the podcast and help it to continue to spread and grow, there are a few ways you can help. Number one, pass it along to a friend or share it on social media. Word of mouth recommendations are the most powerful way for ideas to spread, so I'd love it if you could share the podcast with a few pals who might enjoy it. Number two, you can go to Apple Podcasts and give it a 5-star review. Good reviews encourage the Apple overlords to suggest the podcast to others. So there's a link in the notes if you'd be so kind as to give it 5 stars. Number 3, you can support the podcast financially via Patreon, and there are exclusive benefits for those who do, including a monthly behind-the-scenes newsletter, Mountain and Prairie stickers, live and recorded video chats with podcast guests, and much more. Number 4, I've also got 2 emails that I send out. The first is my weekly email called Good News from the American West, which I send out every Wednesday. It's only positive news, something we can all use a little more of these days. And my other email is my bi-monthly book recommendations email. One email every other month with 5, 6, 7, or 8 books that I've recently read and highly recommend. The thousands of people on both of these lists will vouch for me. No spam or other funny business. And number 5, finally, check out my online store for Mountain and Prairie stickers, shirts, and coffee mugs. I've got some really cool designs from Western artists with more on the way. So head to mountainandprairie.com/shop to check it all out. I'd love to connect with you. I'm on Instagram and LinkedIn, so look me up on either of those platforms by my name or through the links on my website. All right, that's it. Thanks so much for your support.